Big policy decisions have been taken on how to respond to the pandemic, based in part on projections of the number of people who might die and what proportion of those infected might develop serious illness. But 6 months on, and there are still many questions about the virus. How does our immune system respond? How can we stop people getting sick? And even how many people have been infected?
There's plenty of things we do know, but it seems that the list of things we don't know is even larger. I mean, we understand that age is very important in moving on to severe disease, but we don't know how that process starts. We don't know, the asymptomatic cases. We don't know how you move from that first week, which seems relatively mild, to that second week when it's pretty severe. We don't know how to prevent that severe disease, and actually recognizing who is going to go on to that severe disease would also be very useful.
People who are asymptomatic may also provide clues to understanding the illness. Not everyone infected gets symptoms, but as yet, it's unclear what proportion of people are asymptomatic. Studies done throughout the pandemic in different countries suggest it could be anywhere between 5% and 75%, a really broad range.
The asymptomatic cases are the hard ones to find, for any infectious disease. Those are the people who don't report. And so the only way we find those is by either systematically testing everybody or large numbers of people, or by these serological surveys. But some people probably have a very mild infection in the upper airways and hardly even notice or may not notice at all. Those are the asymptomatics. If we can work out how they manage to contain the virus so effectively, maybe we can learn how to progress that on to other people so that everyone could be protected.
In the early stages of the outbreak, some estimates suggested that 80% of people will get COVID-19 and 1% of cases will die. This is known as the case fatality ratio or rate. But again, when it comes to these figures in this coronavirus pandemic, there's still yet more uncertainty. The fatality ratio has been calculated as high as 18% in France, going all the way down to 0.06% in Singapore. Again, a really broad range. In previous pandemics, such as swine flu, initial fatality ratios have started high and trended downwards. This is because when the virus first comes to light, it's often in the sickest people who may go on to die. But over time, more and more people who have had a mild illness come forward.
The case fatality rate will clearly change depending on the population structure. As there's a lot of younger people, then those are less likely to get severe disease and probably more likely to be asymptomatic. But more realistically, many places are only looking at the hospital case fatality rate, which are those people that were severe enough to go into hospital, and the fatality rate based on that number, which would obviously be much higher than those people if you included the asymptomatics and others as well. So calculating that number is rather difficult.
All this continued uncertainty shows the challenges of making decisions about how to tackle a pandemic. Underestimate how deadly a virus is, and thousands may die from being infected. Overestimate it, and with the benefit of hindsight, people will say measures taken are an overreaction.
Deb Cohen with that report. Well, joining us now, Graham Medley, Professor of Infectious Disease Modelling at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and a member of the SAGE scientific group that is advising our government. Graham, we still don't know how many people have been infected with COVID. That's certainly true. And I was remembering back in March, you told us that we were going to have to generate herd immunity to solve the crisis, requiring the majority to become infected. Would you, these months on, stand by that?
I was talking then about when this is all over, and we're not over it yet. So at the moment, we're still in a position whereby if we go back to having contact rates as we had back in March, we will go back into an exponential growth. And the only thing that stops that is some kind of immunity, either vaccine generated or potentially infection generated. We don't know whether the infections and the immunity infected will wane or will last forever, but we have to stay in a COVID secure environment. We have to keep contact rates until we get to a point where it becomes an endemic disease and isn't still an epidemic disease, which it is at the moment.
I remember you used that extraordinary phrase, and it was, to some extent tongue-in-cheek, but you said if I could put more vulnerable people in the north of Scotland and have a nice big epidemic in Kent. Now, you acknowledge you can't do that, but I wonder if you think that's broadly where we're heading now, that we are looking now for that kind of herd immunity where, I mean, I'll show you a picture if we can of a beach in Bournemouth today, which it was pretty much, there doesn't seem to be a lot of social distancing on that beach. I'm wondering if that is, in one way, your dream scenario now. This is the herd immunity in action.
No, well, I can't see the picture, but no, I mean, theoretically, yes, that if people who are not going to get diseased are infected, then they cannot, and they become immune, then they cannot transmit to people who would get disease. It's not something that you want to happen. It's something that, if you don't stop it, will happen anyway, that infection will happen unless you prevent it happening. And we're preventing it happening now with the social distancing, the track and trace and everything else in place. And so we're actually preventing that happening. It's the end. So whether that's next year or 2 years or 3 years, I mean, I said back in March that the longer we take to get to that point where this is a disease like TB, like HIV, very sort of deadly diseases that we have in the UK all the time, unless we get to that point, or until we get to that point, wherever it is, we'll have to have some kind of COVID security.
We really don't know the numbers. I mean, that's very clear. And I know one of the government scientists suggested that 80% of the population could still get it. Do you think it's possible that that could be wrong and that there are many, many more people that are immune to it?
We don't know that everybody can be infected. There might be some people who are refractory to infection. So, the case of 80% comes from the rate of transmission, which was apparent during March, but that actually might have been driven a lot by people coming from overseas with the infection. So although that number is as vague as most of the other numbers associated with this virus, if we'd gone forward and had a major epidemic and we hadn't introduced the measures in March, then we would have seen over half the country infected.
We spoke to you right at the beginning of this back in March, and we're now getting to a place where broadly we are unlocking. I wonder if you're thinking very differently within your own science as to how you would have handled this or we should have handled this.
I think where we are now, kind of looking back, is obviously something that people want to do, and we're always learning. I mean, that's the whole point of science, is that it learns as we go forward. And so thinking from where we are now and looking forward, I think is a much more productive thing to do. And I think there are two kind of broad scenarios which are equally plausible, but not necessarily equally likely. One is that as we start easing, people start going back outside, the incidence is actually very low now, and so the risks are very small. And if we forget to behave as though we're infected, if we forget the social distancing because it's not happening, we go to the beach, and nothing much happens because of that visit to the beach, then we could end up with a position whereby people start behaving as though there is no virus, and that's paradoxically just when we would have another epidemic. The alternative scenario is that track and trace works, and that people continue to engage with track and trace and continue to behave as though they might be infected and not transmit. And then we can carry on into the winter, which is something that people are concerned about. Schools can reopen, and we can actually get through to some point in the future without having a second wave. But I think it's so those two scenarios are equally plausible, but which is more likely, I think, is unsure.
Graham Medley, thank you. Thanks.